Millie stood at a bus stop in the city center, holding a cup of hot coffee, which slightly warmed her frozen fingers. Winter had come unexpectedly early this year, and the cold was chilling her to the bone. The wind mercilessly ruffled her dark hair, and snowflakes settled on her eyelashes, creating the feeling of a fairy tale halo. She looked at the stream of cars rushing past, trying to collect her thoughts before an important meeting. Millie had recently gotten a job as an assistant at the police department, and today she was supposed to work for the first time with the famous criminal psychologist Carlos Gomez. His name was on everyone's lips, a mysterious, brilliant, but incredibly difficult person to communicate with. Millie sighed, straightened her coat once more, and, gathering her will into a fist, headed to the entrance to the police building. At the reception, she was met by a young employee who led the girl along the corridors filled with noise, the smell of coffee and paper folders. "You're Millie, right?" he asked, opening the door to the office. "Carlos is already waiting for you." Millie nodded, feeling a clench of excitement inside her. When she entered, she was met with Carlos' casual but piercing gaze. He was sitting at a desk covered in paperwork, looking as if he expected his time to be wasted again. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his fingers were stained with ink from endless notes. "You're late," he said shortly, not even looking in her direction. "Sorry, Millie began, but he stopped her with a gesture. "Okay, never mind. Sit down. I hope you understand that working with me is not a walk in the park." Millie sat down opposite him, trying not to show her excitement. "Yeah, I understand. But I'm ready to learn." Carlos looked up and looked at her more closely. There was something in her voice that made him pause. "We'll see," he said quietly. "Now, let's get down to business. Here are the files on the current case. Read them and tell me what you think." He handed her a thick folder. Millie wasted no time in reading, trying to figure out what kind of story lay behind the pages. Carlos watched her as she delved into the details. There was something about her focused face, the way she read, that set her apart from the many other assistants he knew. After a few minutes, Millie put the folder down and said, "This looks like a case involving a series of crimes. The motive seems to be repeating itself." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "And what do you suggest?" Millie hesitated for a second, but then answered confidently, "It's possible that the perpetrator is choosing his victims according to a certain pattern. We need to figure out what unites them." Carlos smiled slightly. It was the first spark of interest he had shown since they had met. "Not bad, Millie. Very good. Perhaps you are not as useless as I thought." Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she merely nodded. "Thank you, sir." "Don't call me sir," he snapped. "I'm Carlos. Now go home and prepare yourself. Tomorrow will be a difficult day." As Millie left the office, her heart was beating faster than usual. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her efforts might be appreciated. Working with Carlos might be difficult, but deep down she knew that this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. The next morning, Millie arrived at work early. Her excitement was almost palpable, but she knew that she had to pull herself together so as not to disappoint Carlos. She sat in the conference room, looking over the case file, until Carlos walked into the office. His confident stride and concentrated expression immediately filled the room with tension. "You're here ahead of time," he noted, sitting down opposite her. "Commendable. I hope you've managed to come up with something." Millie nodded, handing him her notes. "I've studied the materials again and noticed that the victims are not just connected. They all worked at the same company several years ago. Perhaps this is the key to the solution." Carlos glanced at her notes and chuckled. "Not bad for a rookie. Let's see what else you can do. Today we're going to the scene of the latest crime." Millie was surprised, but quickly got ready. Carlos didn't give her time for doubt or reflection. Half an hour later, they were driving in the car, and Millie tried to concentrate on the road so as not to succumb to nervous tension. Carlos was silent, only occasionally glancing at her. "Are you always so silent?" She couldn't resist trying to defuse the situation. He looked at her, and a shadow of a smile flashed in his eyes. Only when I think. And now I'm thinking about what awaits you. The crime scene turned out to be a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The police had already removed the body, but the signs of a struggle and the blood on the floor indicated how brutal the killer had been. Millie felt her insides twist, but she tried to keep a straight face. "Look around," Carlos said. "What do you see?" Millie looked around. There was a broken mug on the table, a torn curtain in the corner, and a single earring on the floor. Her gaze lingered on the last item. Could this be the victim's earring, or the perpetrator's? She suggested. Carlos nodded, noting her observation. "Okay. Take it for analysis. Maybe it will give us a lead." Millie carefully packed the earring in a bag, feeling Carlos watching her every move. She knew this was her test, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. There was silence at the station on the way back. Millie was going over everything she had seen in her head, trying to put the big picture together. Carlos suddenly broke the silence. "Don't let your emotions get in the way of your work. If you want to be useful, learn to detach yourself." His words were stern, but Millie knew he was telling the truth. She nodded. "I'll try." Carlos chuckled. "Try harder. Otherwise, you won't last long here." Millie could feel her pride burning at his words, but she was determined to prove she could handle it. She had a long night of studying the materials and analyzing the evidence. But she knew one thing for sure: this was only the first step in gaining Carlos's trust. The atmosphere in the dimly lit conference room at the police station was tense. The screen, which displayed crime scene photographs and victim files, illuminated the stern faces of the detectives. Carlos, leaning on the edge of the table, listened with quiet concentration to the reports from his staff. His gaze was penetrating, as if he already knew the answers to all the questions. Millie sat a little to the side, writing down every detail in a notebook. Her role seemed secondary, but tension was seething inside her. This was her first participation in a full-fledged investigation. She felt not only Carlos's gaze on her, but also the hidden criticism of the others. Newcomers were not welcome here. So, all the victims are men, aged between 30 and 40. The connection between them has not yet been established. The detective's voice broke the silence. The killer leaves a characteristic trace. In the hand of each victim, we find a note with an incomprehensible symbol. Carlos straightened up, his eyes narrowed. "A symbol?" he asked, not hiding his interest. "Show me." An image appeared on the screen, a strange sign, reminiscent of a weave of lines and circles. Millie squinted, trying to figure out its meaning. "It looks like something ancient," she muttered quietly. Her words interrupted Carlos, who immediately turned to her. "What did you say?" His voice was sharp, but not harsh. "It looks like an ancient symbol. Perhaps something from mythology or ancient rituals," Millie explained, trying to sound confident. Carlos tilted his head, looking at her appraisingly. "Go on." "I studied this kind of thing a little at university. This symbol reminds me of patterns used in purification rituals, or to mark sacrifices." A silence fell over the room. Carlos smiled slowly, a shadow of respect appearing on his face. "Interesting, Millie. Very interesting. We need more information about this. You will look into this matter." "Of course," she replied, feeling a spark of pride light up in her chest. Late in the evening, after most of the employees had already left the building, Millie and Carlos remained in the office. They were studying the archives, trying to find references to the symbol in old cases. "Don't you think it's strange that you're here so late?" Carlos suddenly asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but his gaze was tense. "No," Millie smiled, not looking up from the document. "I want to understand how everything works. And I like this job." Carlos suddenly laughed. "Like it? You haven't had to face real horrors yet. This is not a game. I know, she answered firmly, looking him straight in the eyes. But if I can help at least one person, it's worth it. Her words made Carlos think. He was not used to such sincerity and simplicity. There was something unusual about Millie that he could not yet explain. You are amazing, Millie, he murmured, barely audible. She did not answer, simply returned to the documents, but the slight smile on her face betrayed her emotions. That night, their cooperation became something more. The morning began with a lingering ringing of the alarm clock and a foggy sky, as if heralding a new round in their complicated relationship. Millie, holding a thermos of coffee, stood in front of Carlos's office, gathering her courage. After yesterday's incident, their interaction acquired a strange mixture of mistrust and hidden interest. Inside the office, Carlos sat at his desk, leafing through notes. He seemed more focused than usual, but he also seemed to be waiting for Millie. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening for a moment. You're late, he said, this time without irritation. Only 2 minutes, she countered, closing the door behind her. Carlos chuckled slightly. He was surprised by her boldness, although he didn't show it outwardly. Sit down. We have new information on the case. Millie approached the desk, and Carlos handed her several photographs and printouts. Among them were new leads related to the symbol found at the crime scenes. One of the photographs showed a mysterious drawing on the wall of one of the houses. It's an ancient sign of sacrifice, Millie said, studying the image. Such signs were used for rituals of purification or protection. Carlos, leaning over the desk, listened intently. Interesting. And what does that have to do with our victims? He asked, choosing his words carefully. I think the killer sees himself as some kind of savior. He believes he's cleansing these people of their sins, Millie suggested, trying to sound confident. Carlos paused, considering her words. You see what most people miss. That's good, Millie, he said, putting the papers aside. But next time, if you have an idea, tell me right away, without waiting for me to ask. Her lips twitched in a weak smile. I understand. That evening, the two of them went to the scene of the latest crime. It was a small house on the outskirts of town. It was cold and uneasy inside. Millie could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she tried not to show her fear. Carlos walked ahead, confidently surveying the surroundings. Something's wrong here, he said, stopping at one of the walls. Millie walked closer, following his directions. There was a faint handprint on the wall, stained with something dark. Is it blood? She asked, keeping her voice from shaking. Carlos nodded, his face impassive. Maybe. But it's fresh. The killer was here just recently. The words made Millie freeze. She looked around, expecting to see someone in the darkness. Carlos noticed her anxiety and put his hand on her shoulder. Don't be afraid. I'm here. His voice was unexpectedly warm. For a moment, her fear retreated. She realized that behind his cold exterior was a man who was ready to protect those who were important to him. Thank you, she answered quietly, feeling their connection grow stronger. Later, back in the office, they were sorting through the evidence they had collected. The night had caught them by surprise, but neither of them felt tired. For the first time, Millie realized how strong her affection for this man was. He was far from perfect, but it was his complex character and sharp mind that attracted her like a magnet. Carlos, catching her thoughtful look, stopped. You think too much, Millie. It's dangerous. She smiled. And you think too little about the feelings of others. It's also dangerous. Their gazes met. At that moment, something inexplicable, but incredibly important, happened between them. The work on the case was progressing rapidly, but the tension between Millie and Carlos was becoming almost tangible. They spent more and more time together, delving into the details of the investigation, and with each passing day their interactions acquired a deeper shade. However, neither of them dared to cross the invisible line. The evening hours found them working in the office. Carlos, concentrating on studying crime scene maps, was becoming more and more lost in his thoughts. Millie, meanwhile, was carefully leafing through the diary entries they had found in the home of one of the victims. Suddenly, she stopped. "Carlos, look at this," she said, linking to the page. "There's a reference to a meeting with an unknown person who offered purification." He looked up, his interest instantly revived. This could be a clue. The description matches the killer's profile. Millie turned, but her face remained tense. "You know what's weird? These notes look encrypted. The words and dates don't match up quite right. There might be a code hidden here." Carlos moved closer, studying her find. He couldn't help but notice how absorbed Millie was in her work, the excitement in her eyes. It fascinated him, though he'd never admit it. "You're right," he said, nodding. "We need to decipher this. If it's a code, there might be a place hidden in it where he can strike next." Several hours later, Millie was still sitting at the table trying to solve the riddle when Carlos brought her a cup of tea. His action was unexpected, but unexpectedly touching. "You're overdoing it," he said, sitting down next to her. "It's not illegal to take a break." Millie smiled gratefully and took a sip of hot tea. "I just want to help. This is important to me as well as to you." Her words touched something inside Carlos. He realized that she was more than just an assistant, someone who had come to trust more than anyone before. "I appreciate it, Millie," he said quietly. "But you don't think you'll take on the entire burden?" She looked at him in surprise. "And you? Aren't you doing the same thing?" Carlos paused, realizing that she was right now. It was close to midnight when Millie finally cracked the code. He had booked an old abandoned theater on the outskirts of town. The theater was known for its atrocities, and its empty halls were perfect for the killer's next act. "We must contact the team immediately," she said, rising from her seat. Carlos turned, his face becoming serious. "But be careful. It could be a trap." When they arrived at the theater, the silence was oppressive. Snow was slowly falling from the sky, covering the ground in layers. Millie felt her heart pounding, but she tried to keep her temper. Carlos walked ahead, his figure confident despite the tense atmosphere. The inside of the building was even more gloomy. Creaking floors, dusty wings, and the smell of ancient wooden creatures made it feel like they had entered another world. But the most frightening thing was yet to come. A huge banner appeared on the stage with the same symbol they had found on the chairs. "It's his signature," Millie whispered. Carlos figured it out. "He's here. And he wants us to know it." Suddenly, there was a noise behind them. Millie turned around, but before she could notice, Carlos grabbed her hand and pulled her backstage. "It could be dangerous, stay close," he said, trying not to give away his sound. They hid in the darkness, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Millie felt his hand tighten around hers. The touch was both comforting and frightening. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Carlos looked at her, his eyes shining in the dim light. "No. As long as you're here, I know I can handle it." These words made her heart skip a beat. For the first time, Carlos showed that he was not just a cold analyst, but also a person capable of deep feelings. The continuation of their night in the theater marked the beginning of new stages in their relationship. Together, they were not only a team, but also something more. The scene in the old theater was a turning point for Millie and Carlos. After they found the killer and brought him to light, they had to report, risking their lives. But this night not only included the end of a series of calls, it changed their angles. Carlos stood at the window of his office and looked out at the cityscape. The case was closed, but there was uncertainty in his heart. He was not used to getting attached to people, his world had always been cold and rational. However, Millie broke this barrier. She turned out to be not only a reliable partner, but also the person who brought a spark of warmth into his life. Millie entered the office, holding 2 glasses of coffee in her hands. She was smiling, despite the sunset. I thought I might offer you some coffee, she said, setting the glass on his desk. Carlos turned to look at her with a small smile. Thank you. But you know I prefer tea. She chuckled. It's just an excuse to come in. Their eyes met, and the silence in the room became almost tangible. Millie sat down opposite, slightly embarrassed as she adjusted her hair. Is something wrong? She asked. Carlos was silent for a few seconds, then stood up and came closer. Millie, I have to tell you something. She froze, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. His voice was serious, but there was something new in his eyes, a softness she had never seen before. You changed me, he continued. I always thought that feelings and attachments interfered with my work, that they made a person weak. But you proved that this is not so. You are my strength. Millie felt her eyes fill with tears. She did not expect such words from a man who always hid his emotions behind a mask of coldness. Carlos, she began, I wanted to tell you too. You made me stronger. I never thought I could be a part of something so important. You believed in me, and that means everything to me. He took her hand carefully, his touch soft but firm. I don't know where this will lead us, but I want to try. If you don't mind, of course. Millie smiled, feeling all her doubts and fears dissolve. I don't mind, she answered quietly. A few months later, Millie and Carlos were working on a new case, but now they were more than just partners. Their relationship had become a part of their lives, making them both stronger. They learned to trust each other not only professionally, but also personally. One evening, while walking through the park, Carlos suddenly stopped and turned to Millie. You know what's most surprising? He asked, looking into her eyes. What? She answered with a smile. The way you burst into my life and turned it upside down. And I'm glad for this chaos. Millie laughed and, coming closer, touched his hand. I'm glad too. This chaos has become my home. And at that moment, under the starry sky, Carlos felt for the first time in his life that he was not alone. And Millie knew that she had found her place, next to him, in their common future.